Right, so welcome to the Joint Degree Program. My name is Hiroaki Ataka, Associate Dean for the Joint Degree Program here at Ritsumeikan. And we welcome you once again to the joint venture between American University and Ritsumeikan University. Today, we want to talk a little bit about global IR, particularly introducing you a little bit to the newly founded approach before you actually study here at the Joint Degree Program. Brief outline for today is that we'll talk a little bit about IR itself, the discipline, how it, the different issues and agendas that we'll study, particularly on international and global, and also a little bit about what is theory and theory as abstraction. Finally, on to what is global IR. I do have a couple of discussion points, also further readings in case those of you that actually want to study a little bit further before you start the actual program. Okay, so IR as a discipline, first of all, basically it's a study of problems, issues beyond the border, beyond the state society. And here we can actually divide it into two, traditional core and contemporary international relations. The traditional core is much more about state-to-state relations, issues concerning the development and change of sovereign statehood in the context of larger systems or society of states. And here we have the issues about war and peace as the central sort of guiding problem of this. And also contemporary IR, which is concerned not just about the political or security aspects of relations between states, but a bit wider set of approaches. So things like globalization, human rights, multinational companies, international organizations, environment, gender, culture, and so on. Fairly broad range of issues that we study more in the contemporary phase of the discipline. Now, looking at the object of study in IR, there's a slight difference, international and global. So the first one, the more traditional core of IR is the classic international relations. Here we have the relations between states as the main sort of things that we study, things like diplomacy, security, trade disputes, UN, particularly on the political or security aspects is as a central sort of focus. And contemporary, more global set of relations, those are things that sort of fall a little bit beyond the state-centric worldview. And this includes studies on things like global finance, environment, culture, ethnicity, terrorism. And basically, IR creates sort of a tool that enables us to understand systematically or allows us to compare different phenomena that arises on the international and global level. So if you think about things like internationalization and globalization, the difference between those two, one focusing much more on the international state-to-state relations, and the other that goes a little bit beyond state relations. Or things like the distinction between war and conflict. In that case, war are much more of a state-to-state relations. Yes, it is actually regulated by certain sets of rules, international law, and compare that with things like conflict, which actually goes a little bit beyond, again, the state-centric worldview, and a little less regulated, a little less governed, right, compared to issues about war. So looking at slightly differently, traditional, international, and much more contemporary IR focused more on the global. So with that in mind, if we move on a little bit to what is theory, because here, because IR is about creating the tools to understand how the phenomena actually emerges both on international and also on the global, we need to know how we use things like the concepts and theories of IR. And first of all, on why. Complexity of the world is a very simple answer to that. The need for some sort of a simplification. Basically, the world is pretty complex. In order to understand the various aspects of it, we need to actually simplify, focus on certain aspects of it, rather than try to understand every single event or phenomena in one go. So to that extent, theory is very practical. Theory is a simplifier. It identifies the things that matter. Right? Professionals use it, doctors, lawyers, business entrepreneurs, politicians. They both or all use theory all the time. So it's not just in the academic sense, but also does have a practical relevance to it. Now, you might think, okay, so fair enough. So we do need theories in order to understand international relations, a fairly complex world that we study. But once you actually get into the different courses, you'll hear about a lot of different theories. And here, the question might be, well, why do we need so many theories? And again, the simple answer to that is that different things are important to different people. So where you stand actually determines what you see, and this directly connects to global IR, particularly in relation to where these concepts, theories that we talk about in IR actually comes from. You know, whether it is from a Western origin or from other places. Hence, the message that I want to say here is to be critical of what each of the theories are saying. And once they actually have that critical mentality, you actually have, or you have the starting sort of attribute to think in a global IR sense. Now, thinking a little bit about this more from an academic point of view, is to talk about this as an abstraction. And here we talk about the same thing, but understanding the world at different levels means something different, right? So the lowest level of abstraction is basically the endless details of our world. And to a certain extent, we do need to move up the ladder of simplification. At certain points, you have the level of abstraction that journalists are very good at. So fairly detailed, but nonetheless, rather than every single aspect, they do still pick and choose between what is important, what is not important. For those of us that study about IR, we actually go up a little bit of that ladder of abstraction. So hence, we actually talk a little bit more abstract concepts, theories. And one of the reasons for that is because whereas for the journalists, they actually want to talk about fairly detailed, concrete issues about how foreign policy is made, right? So they might actually focus on which politicians did what, who played the role of the influential figure, whatnot, and they're pretty good at actually doing that. Whereas for us, it's a little bit more about, rather than this sort of particularly unique case about creating foreign policy in a particular country, in a particular historical time, but to be able to use that concepts, ideas, and compare between different cases, right? So hence, a lot of the concepts that you probably will study when you come in to our program is rather general or abstract at first, you might think. But one of the reasons for that is because we want to compare between different locations, also to a certain extent, different historical periods. So to that extent, moving up the ladder of abstraction does not necessarily remove competing theoretical explanations, and also that IR and IR theory actually tends to be characterized by very abstract claim at fairly high level of abstraction. Okay. So with this in mind, moving on to global IR. So why, right? Up to this point, you might have suspected a little bit already, but because we actually need a global perspective, something that goes beyond simply assuming a world of states or the international, as we saw a couple of slides ago. And also, particularly because the sort of common sense that we talk about, those things that we study when we talk about the international, right? The state-to-state relations, diplomatic codes of conduct, for instance. All these things are actually very Eurocentric. Things or practices that have emanated or emerged in Europe, 18th, 19th century, and has spread to the rest of the world. One of those examples I have there is between politics and religion. Usually, we usually think that those things don't really mix, right? But actually, this emanates much more from a Western or European origin. And particularly those of you that come from or are fairly familiar with the Muslim world community will probably know, but there, religion actually permeates every aspect of our lives, including politics. And for them, it's very natural, right, for these things to be on a continuum. Whereas, of course, on the common sense level of the international, we regard it as something that should be separate. Where do these things actually come from? Well, once we actually historicize or look back historically at these things, we can understand that it has a much more of a Western or European biases to it. So not merely assuming concepts derive from European origins apply universally, but to put them back into the historical, geographical, cultural context is the first and foremost aim of global IR. So to that extent, global IR actually rethinks assumptions and relevance of international relations itself in the 21st century. Now, Professor Acharya, our very own, and you'll probably get to know him at SIS, he talks about 6 characteristics of global IR. Of course, he is one of the leading figures that talks about global IR. And here he talks about 6 points that it should actually be applicable universally, but also include some sort of a pluralistic idea, so not one size fits all type of idea. Also that it is grounded in world history, so rather than assuming that Western history equals world history, to actually look at Indian or Indo-Pacific history, Sinocentric history, etc. Also, number 3, subsumes rather than supplants existing IR theories and methods. So to that extent, we're actually trying to complement, go a little bit beyond what we actually study as IR already. Fourth, integrates the study of regions, regionalisms, also area studies, and of course, as you see the curriculum of the JDP, you'll probably find out that that is one of the central pillars of this joint degree program. Number 5, that is choose exceptionalism. And also number 6 recognizes multiple forms of agency. Slightly academic, so we'll talk a little bit more about it once we get a little bit more going into the program itself. Okay, so very brief, but the points are as written. So we have a traditional core and a more contemporary set of IR that focuses one more on the international and another one more on the global. We do talk quite a lot about theory, and also that theory is a very useful tool to understand about international relations in a much more systematic manner. But global IR is something that critically looks at some of these assumptions behind theories, right? Tries to go beyond some of the Eurocentric assumptions that the study has taken. And last but not least, so global IR is basically a sort of a frame of mind, right, that takes us away from the state-centric and therefore, I suppose, Eurocentric notions of the international towards the global. So I hope this short lecture gets you started thinking a little bit about international relations in a more global manner. And we look forward to studying together here in Kyoto. The slides that follow are a little bit for food for thought, the discussion points, and further readings. The further readings, once you are able to access either AU or RU library, you'll be able to access these resources. So please take a look at it and perhaps read some of that before you actually join the program. Thank you very much.